Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, which is a partnership between War on the Rocks and the University of Texas at Austin. Today's discussion features a panel discussing the October 7th Hamas terrorist attack on Israel, the likely Israeli response, and the broader regional implications of that response and the Hamas terrorist attack. And with that, on to the show.
My name is Bobby Chesney. I'm the Dean of the Law School here at UT. But I'm here to share some thoughts of a purely personal nature that are rooted in my own academic expertise. As a young scholar, or would-be scholar, I should say, because the whole point of this story is I didn't yet have a job in academia, in the 1990s, I developed something of an obsession with the topic of terrorism. I think it's fair to say, obsessively horrified with the phenomenon of people who would use violence intentionally against random individuals to advance their political or social goals. I found it morally and to a certain extent even physically revolting, repugnant. And so as I entered into my aspirations as a law professor, I was looking for a way to study terrorism and counterterrorism from a legal perspective. I tried for a few years to get hired in academia doing that sort of work. But in the late 90s, though many of us were very focused on what was at the time clearly a significant problem of terrorism in the world, that had taken a sort of I think Walter LaCour called it the mass casualty terrorism turn. It was hard to get hired, and I wasn't having much success until 2001, until 9/11. Now that day I was practicing law in Midtown Manhattan, blissfully ignorant of what was about to unfold downtown. My wife was on a plane crossing the country, blissfully ignorant about what was going to happen on some other planes. By pure luck, neither of us, we were close, both of us in our own ways. We were close, but not actually where the harm was about to occur. But occur it did, and it changed so much in this country and the world. One odd side effect was suddenly there was interest in national security law, counterterrorism law. I got hired, and for a couple of decades plus now, I've been writing constantly about terrorism, counterterrorism, and related issues. One of my most ambitious projects, the thing that's my most passionately held project, is one that's not seen the light of the day. It's a book I've been writing forever. It's not finished. Don't tell my publisher I was talking about this, because Lord knows when this is ever going to get finished. It's a history. It's a history of this idea, this incredibly noble and valuable, civilizationally relevant idea that it's not right to intentionally try to kill innocents to advance your political or social goals. And in general, over time, I think it's fair to say that across 2 millennia of struggling with this issue, we'd made some decent progress only in the past couple of centuries. And of course, we all know there's endless violations of this principle, endless violations. But if you study the history, the arc over 2 millennia had been very, very positive as far as it goes until recently. I'd always been optimistic in writing this book, but the past year or so is beginning to make me think that there's a risk that this was a high water mark. Events in Russia, specifically, not just the invasion itself, but the relentless and repeated overt targeting of civilian objects and civilians by Russia in Ukraine has been a massive blow to the ideal. And the unwillingness of so many countries and leaders around the world to just acknowledge that at least that part of it is morally repugnant and wrong, that is a blow too. Now comes Hamas. Hamas not agreeing with this principle is no surprise to anyone who knows anything. But the scale and particulars of this barbarity and the horror that's been unleashed so intentionally on civilians in Israel, it's jaw-dropping, doesn't begin to describe it. And the willingness of some to defending it on the grounds of their appreciation for the underlying cause driving it, that too is devastating. Ends do not and cannot justify such means. This is an essential civilizational human achievement to try to instantiate this rule. And it's under assault now. Now on to our event. The event has a much wider scope than what I just emphasized, but I I felt compelled to share that with y'all. Whether you agree with what I said or what the others are about to say, I'm so glad you're all here tonight. We are a university. This is a place for ideas and discussion and deliberations. So thank you for making that part of what you did today. I want to appreciate the Strauss Center, the Clements Center, the Intelligence Studies Project, and the America in the World Consortium for making this event happen. And I'm delighted to turn the microphone over in just a moment to my law school colleague, Professor Adam Klein, who's the director of the Strauss Center and formerly chair of the U.S. government's Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. I'll apologize in advance. I'm pre-committed to another event, so I'm going to leave early. I'm going to stand in the back. It's not lack of appreciation for what y'all are going to say. Adam, the floor is yours. Thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you so much, Dean Chesney, Bobby. That was profound and moving, and I think Dean Chesney really encapsulated the philosophical and moral underpinnings of why we're here and the profound moral questions that it raises so well. I had some remarks prepared on that front. I will not try to repeat what he said. But as the leader of a campus center and representing my colleagues here who are also leaders of campus centers, I want to transition to talk about how we view our role on campus at difficult times like this. This event and preparing for it brought me back to an event that we held last April, on war crimes and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so I went back and looked at the announcement for the event. And I found this line in there. Russian atrocities in Ukraine have shocked the world, reviving memories of some of the darkest moments of the 20th century. And here we are again. We are looking deep, deep into the abyss of human cruelty. We are facing uncertainty. We are facing a disordered world where assumptions that we had made about the rules of the road, about global order, are being shaken. And so as campus centers, it is our job as people who have served in government office in the United States and the many experts we're able to call on to help the community find a forum where we can wrestle with these questions, not merely on a philosophical and moral level, but more practically on a policy level, as citizens who are ultimately called on to participate in our own government's decision-making about these things. And I think it's important to note here that this attack already appears to have killed more than 24 Americans. And like Professor Chesney, I also study terrorism, and I did some research. That makes this the second deadliest Islamist attack for Americans since 9/11 already, based on the information we know now. And in case you're wondering, it was the Pulse nightclub attack in Orlando that holds the other spot. Other Americans are also likely being held in tunnels beneath Gaza as we speak. So this is also an American crisis, and the reaction of our leaders and of our military forces gives a sense of that as well. We're very lucky tonight to help as we grapple with these questions, with questions not just about regional dynamics, but about world order and American policy, to have three, and yes, we will have three, very distinguished former U.S. government officials, experts in diplomacy, statecraft, intelligence, and national security. Professor Steve Slick is director of the Intelligence Studies Project, which is a joint partnership between my center, the Robert Strauss Center, and the Clements Center for National Security. Professor Slick retired in 2014 after 28 very distinguished years as a member of the CIA's clandestine service. He also served for 4 years as a special assistant to President George W. Bush at the White House, where he was senior director for intelligence programs and reform on the National Security Council staff. And that position is truly one of the most important in the U.S. government for bringing intelligence at moments of national crisis to policymakers. He's had many other honors in his career as an intelligence professional, and we're very grateful to have him here tonight. Paul Edgar, whom you see in the second chair, is the interim executive director of the Clements Center for National Security here at UT Austin. He holds a PhD in Middle Eastern languages and cultures from the University of Texas, and he studies the historical origins of diplomacy, war, and strategy in pre-classical antiquity. He is a retired U.S. Army officer where he served for more than 22 years in the infantry as a conventional paratrooper and also in special operations units. In his final assignment for the Army, he did work that's directly relevant to our discussion tonight. He was the political advisor for Israeli affairs to the United States Security Coordinator in Jerusalem. And in that role, he had many contacts with security officials, both on the Israeli side and for the Palestinian Authority. And then I will go ahead and introduce our missing but soon-to-be-arrived third panelist, Simone Ledeen, who previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East and is also a senior fellow with the Strauss Center. At the Department of Defense, she was responsible for policy for a long list of Middle Eastern countries, which I will not rattle off, but they include Israel, the Palestinian Authority, Lebanon, and Iran, just to name a few countries that are involved in this present crisis. Before that, she served as the principal director in the Office of the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Special Operations and Combating Terrorism. And indeed, U.S. Special Operations forces have reportedly been dispatched to the region already. She has also worked on hostage rescue matters in the U.S. government and various other counterterrorism functions over the course of a long and distinguished career. So I will now take my seat and rejoin the panelists and turn it over to Professor Slick to talk to us about the intelligence implications facing U.S. policymakers and other countries' policymakers in the present crisis.
Thanks, Adam. I'll dispatch with this from the chair here. That's okay. So thank you all for coming out to join us this evening for a discussion of last weekend's horrific attacks on civilians in Israel. These events are a reminder of the inhumanity of groups that employ indiscriminate violence to achieve their political aims and the need to confront and defeat them. So I'll speak from notes this evening, at least to start off, to ensure that I'm being precise in describing several intelligence issues, and also so that I stay within the allotted time I've been given. So I'll be happy to follow up on any of these topics when the floor is open for questions, and I'm looking forward to that. So the earliest reporting on the attacks last Saturday referred to surprise, lack of warning, and declared this was an intelligence failure. And my reaction to that has been maybe, but not so fast. Intelligence failure is a grossly overworked term, and in this case, so far, an unproven judgment. So it's safe to conclude that Israel's military and political leaders were certainly unprepared for these attacks. The nature of the attacks speaks to that point, but it's too early to conclude that the attacks were unwarned, or that Israel's intelligence failed, and to speculate why and how it may have failed. We should not prejudge this case. The performance of Israel's intelligence agencies, along with the actions of Israel's political and military leaders, will be meticulously examined during an official investigation that will inevitably follow the conclusion of active hostilities. There are many things to commend the Israeli state, and one of them is they have a strong record of confronting directly their past security lapses. They assign accountability, and they make changes to ensure mistakes are not repeated. For example, a fully empowered National Commission met to review the surprise attacks that initiated the Yom Kippur War in 1973. And also Israel's disastrous 2006 incursion into southern Lebanon. Senior officers are dismissed, laws are rewritten, and established practices are changed. So I encourage everybody to withhold judgment on the pre-attack intelligence questions till all the facts are examined by a neutral commission of investigators. And that will happen, and it won't take long, so I recommend it to you in advance. In view of Israel's extensive intelligence collection now, against targets in Gaza, I fully expect the inquiry is going to find ultimately that multiple reports did exist about activities that can, in hindsight, be linked to these attacks. But these reports may not have been understood in context as indicators of an attack, or possibly the reports were understood but not conveyed persuasively to senior military and policy officials. In addition to the extreme secrecy and communications discipline, it's highly likely that Hamas engaged in an active denial and deception effort to disguise their preparations. Another reason to go slow on investigating and assigning blame is that Israel's intelligence agencies are critical to what comes next. Israeli intelligence will be required to support precise retaliatory airstrikes that are underway and possibly a large-scale ground incursion. Similarly, locating and recovering the dozens of hostages will require the undistracted attention of Israel's intelligence services. On the role of U.S. intelligence, our intelligence agencies have close, productive, and trusting relationships with their Israeli counterparts. On targets like Hamas, the U.S. side will rely heavily on its Israeli partners, and rightly so, given their expertise, geographic proximity, and proven effectiveness in counterterrorism operations in Gaza and the occupied West Bank. Now, while the Israeli services focus their attention on Hamas in the coming days, weeks, and months, the U.S. is going to be monitoring the activities and the planning by other states in the region to prevent the conflict from spreading and compounding last weekend's tactical setback with a more harmful strategic surprise. So what are the long-term implications of the Hamas attacks in Gaza for U.S. intelligence? At a bare minimum, this is a stark reminder that the threat from terrorists to the U.S. and its allies was not extinguished with the deaths of Osama bin Laden, Ahmad Boughnia, Qasem Soleimani, and their ilk. Our terrorist enemies are resilient, adaptable, and still lethal. Our intelligence leaders are appropriately in the process now of shifting the community's focus towards peer rivals like China and Russia and away from terrorism. That necessary shift in priorities and resources has been made all the more delicate and potentially dangerous by Hamas's successful weekend of terror in southern Israel. So I'll look forward to your questions when we finish our opening remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. So most of my remarks are about military operations in Gaza, those that we know are going on and those that we anticipate will occur in the near future. And unless something has happened over the last 6 hours or so, while my remarks are my descriptions are very general, this should fairly capture what has happened and what will happen. So currently, Israel's response has been mostly limited to airstrikes. These are predominantly fighter aircraft used to drop smart munitions that can be tailored to specific kinds of targets. And those munitions can be guided to the target by the aircraft itself or by controllers on the ground or elsewhere, some of which Steve alluded to, who are in a position to observe the target and the impact. Israelis also use the AH-64, the Apache attack helicopter, and those are used in a direct fire mode with rapid fire cannons, rockets, and Hellfire missiles. But probably the next phase of, or what we anticipate will be the next phase of this fight, is where we'll see those more. So for a few days now, Israel has been mobilizing its active and reserve ground forces. And for those of you who may have friends who are Israelis, maybe even Israelis here in the United States, I know one in particular, gentleman in his 70s, pushing his 80s, and he mobilized himself to get over there and to help. You have not seen this kind of mobilization in the military, in the Israeli military, since Yom Kippur War in 1973. But this mobilization, of course, is a precursor to what we anticipate is a new phase in prosecuting the fight. And the largest contingent is massing in a few locations just outside of Gaza. And this assembly will be what we generally refer to as a combined arms task force. And that means it will include all of the Army's ground capabilities, such as combat engineers with heavy equipment to breach and clear obstacles and minefields, tank units which can square off against most direct fire threats and move quickly across open terrain like you have there in the coastal plains. Mechanized infantry, which has less protection than armor, but can usually face off against a medium machine gun, maybe a little bit more. And light infantry or ground soldiers on foot, which are the most vulnerable, but can maneuver in many locations that are threatening to those other units. All of these forces will be supported by artillery, generally from behind, and mortar units and the AH-64s that I mentioned before. And so the Israelis are currently deciding what their ground force or what their ground objectives are, and then arranging these forces and planning to use them in a sequence and in a manner that matches what they expect to encounter on their way to their targets. And this could play out in a couple of ways. I anticipate that it would be what, in the United States at least, we call an attack or an assault, where the Israeli forces go and permanently seize or at least seize for a long period of time, seize ground. But it could also occur in what we in what we usually refer to as raids, which is a temporary holding of terrain for a specific purpose, and then leaving that terrain, going back to an operating position further back. So these kinds of operations tend to progress methodically and slowly, and the IDF will chip away, even if it's a raid, at one tactical problem at a time so that they can safely move on to the next. Of course, even if it's deliberate and slow, it will be hard. Hamas has been planning what is essentially a deep defense in an urban area for months or perhaps even years, and they will have thought very thoroughly through the routes available to the approaching IDF task force. And they will employ existing and reinforcing obstacles, minefields of various kinds, and they are observing those with formidable direct fire capabilities like RPGs. They will have thought of many clever ways to disguise these things, these obstacles, minefields, etc., so that the IDF does not identify them until it's too late, until they're caught in the obstacle and killed or vehicles destroyed. So expect that it will take at least several days, but more likely several weeks, before the IDF has seized or destroyed their list of ground targets. This is going to take a while. And some students have asked me about the innocent Palestinians in all of this, and Palestinians, of course, are not equivalent to Hamas. We are often careful to distinguish between the Communist Party of China and the Chinese people, and we can do the same here. We should do the same here. And the Palestinians do have political grievances, which the U.S. has recognized and will continue to recognize once this is over. But Hamas, unfortunately, has not helped that cause. They have made it worse. Though they were popularly elected 15 years ago, or more than 15 years ago, they have not behaved like a credible state, and we have, in return, not recognized them as a credible state. They mix illegitimate claims with those that are legitimate, and they address both with illegitimate means, even sacrificing their own non-combatants in the process. And this recent attack is simply the most egregious example in a long history of similar behavior. So in light of that, let me add now just a brief note on my observations on Israel's practice of what we in the United States often refer to as the law of armed conflict and the law or the law of land warfare. And what I'm talking about here, I'm not trying to give a legal background. That's not my specialty. I'm going to briefly talk about what I have observed, how I have observed them following these laws, and how they get applied uniquely in every fight. So Israel is a signatory to the Geneva Conventions and other relevant international agreements, and in my experience, the IDF takes these rules seriously. They do not intentionally identify non-combatants and non-military structures as legitimate targets. Like most militaries, including our own, they sometimes make mistakes with terrible consequences. Occasionally, their soldiers, like a small handful of our own soldiers, deliberately violate those rules and commit atrocities. But the IDF has processes for investigating, trying, and punishing those who do so. So broadly speaking, we should be confident that the IDF is very serious about focusing their prosecution of this war against those that merit it, and that non-combatant casualties and collateral material damage will be a secondary measured consequence. Of course, it's still tragic, but it will be a secondary measured consequence of Israel pursuing legal military targets. What about the regional military situation and the U.S. role? In order to enable the IDF to focus on Hamas in Gaza, U.S. diplomats are connecting with their regional contacts to prevent Hezbollah and others from causing problems on Israel's northern and northeastern borders. We've moved one carrier group into the eastern Mediterranean, and another is on the way, to signal that we may be willing to use those military assets against Hezbollah and others in order to buy Israel time and space to focus on Gaza. We've also deployed many kinds of military advisors to assist the IDF with particular problems, such as these near impossible hostage rescue situations. And so, in my opinion, while we should take seriously the prospect of a more expansive war, these are prudent measures. A larger war, again, in my opinion, is very unlikely. Last, let me offer my assessment of the Hamas attack. And I'm assessing it not morally. That is absolutely legitimate, but that's not what I'm going to speak about here. I'm going to speak about it practically. We have lots of people speaking about it correctly in moral terms. Let me speak about it practically. In serving the stated goals of Hamas. As a terrorist attack, it was spectacular and wildly successful. As a military attack with an ostensible political goal, it borders on insignificant. Hamas has nothing left in the tank, and it will be virtually non-existent in a matter of a few years, if not sooner. This is going to be a Munich-style manhunt. And I'll end with a quote from Richard Hecht, the current spokesman of the IDF. We plan to get every one of these people, every single one of them.
Thank you, Paul. And Simone Ledeen, we have introduced you. Your background is known to the audience, so you may proceed.
Okay. Well, that's a tough act to follow, particularly because I prepared 0 remarks. But I'm really excited to be here with you today and look forward to this conversation. So you all are aware of my background and aware that I've spent a lot of time in the region. Even recently this summer, I was in Saudi Arabia. Everyone was really excited about the prospect of normalization. I was with a group that met with a number of sort of senior leaders in Saudi Arabia, and they were saying, well, yes, we're very far along in conversations, and so I think, number one, it's critically important to understand the timing of this invasion, this war, and the severity of it. I mean, it happened now because normalization with Saudi Arabia was about to happen. I firmly believe that. So do a lot of other people who spend a lot of time in the region. Iran simply could not allow that to happen. And I say Iran because Hamas is, and I apologize for missing most of your remarks. But okay, excellent. Yeah. So Iran funds is the majority funder of Hamas and always has been. And so, especially when you look at the operation that they conducted, the level of sophistication, the amount of weapons that they had, the amount of training that they had to do, the amount of rehearsals that they had to do, which raised to me a lot of questions about how were they rehearsing the gliders? I mean, where were they doing that from? I have a lot of intelligence questions, actually. But it's clear that Iran was the guiding force behind this, and I'm happy to argue with anybody about that. To me, it's very clear, and it's directly related to the looming normalization with Saudi Arabia, which has definitively been put on ice and is not a prospect in the near term whatsoever, for various reasons. I think one of the important things that we should consider as we watch all of these military developments that Paul just talked about, we need to consider how that's going to sway what people used to call the Arab Street. So in these different countries in the Middle East, how are they going to react to what Hamas is doing, and how are they going to react to what Israel is doing? Right now, a lot of people are shocked. I've heard from a lot of friends in the region, Muslim friends, who were shocked by the level of barbarity, of violence that was conducted. The status quo has been, we'll bomb you for a little bit, then there'll be, reciprocity, someone will reciprocate and bomb the other team for a minute, and then they'll quiet down for a period. That's been the status quo for quite a while, really ever since 2007, when Hamas won the civil war in Gaza between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. So since then, Hamas has ruled 0 elections, et cetera, and there have been these flare-ups of violence, but they've been quelled by various means, and there hasn't been this huge outbreak of violence like we just saw. I have to say, I was wrong. I actually have been doing a lot of reflection over the weekend. Obviously, it's been very emotional. But I've also been doing a lot of reflection because I would say I was one of those people who thought, Hamas, yeah, they're really bad. They've killed a lot of people. But, now they're dealing with bureaucracy. They're running Gaza. I worked in government, so I know how bureaucracy can be. And I mistakenly thought that's really where they were focused, and it had maybe tempered them a bit. It had not. It had not. And they are who they always were. And I think, personally, I'm still working through this, but I think it has changed to me some fundamental beliefs that I held about the world. And I'm very sad about it. I'm very sad about that. So anyway, I could go on and on. I mean, we can talk about every single country in the region and kind of what I've been seeing, what I think their reaction might be. I think there is, I sort of disagree with you. I do think there is a likelihood that Hezbollah will enter the fray. I think because if you believe, as I do, that Iran is sitting over top of all of this, kind of moving the chess pieces, why would they have Hamas attack Israel in such a violent way, knowing how of course Israel is going to respond the way that we all know they're going to respond? Why would you do that unless you're looking for an excuse to say, well, look at all these civilians, there are 2 million civilians in Gaza City. Why would they enter Gaza City? Why would they potentially, they're talking about, potentially staying in Gaza, doing an occupation. We learned a lot of hard lessons from our own occupations in the Middle East. And so why would you encourage that unless there was some kind of follow-on plan? Again, I have no knowledge of the internal workings of this particular plan, but I have watched the region and the regime for many, many years, and this is what I see playing out. So I'm looking forward to the discussion, your questions, and thank you for the opportunity.
That was great, all three of you. Thank you so much. And I think you can see the deep experience that informs how these three former government officials think through these questions. And we'll do a few questions back and forth with the panel. And please do save your energy and your ideas for your own questions. We'll get to the audience as well. Let's follow up a bit on that question of the role of Iran. What is Iran thinking? It seems likely or obvious that the Saudi-Israeli rapprochement was a burr in Iran's saddle and motivated them in some respects to do this. But Professor Slick, perhaps you can talk a bit about how is Iran thinking through these chess moves? Why might they be keeping Hezbollah on the sidelines for now? And just for background, for those of you who don't follow the region that closely, Hezbollah militarily is the strongest force in Lebanon. It has killed many, many Americans over the years in direct attacks on U.S. facilities. It's much stronger than Hamas. It has a more sophisticated rocket arsenal than Hamas. And so militarily, Hezbollah poses a more significant threat to Israel than Hamas does. So Professor Slick, do you have thoughts on that?
Not well-considered thoughts.
We'll hear them anyway.
Adam, you'll take them anyway. I'm not so sure how I feel about this. The one thing I know is that as an intelligence target, understanding what the intentions are of the theocratic regime in Tehran are sort of among the highest priorities. There's no question, as Simone described, that historically they've been a financial backer of Hamas, they along with the Qataris and other folks. Notwithstanding their record of terrorism, they've consistently claimed that they're supporting Hamas because of the dawah, because of the charitable work that they do, and their responsibilities to provide services to the residents of Gaza. I have no problem accepting that Iran was ultimately a sponsor of the attacks, but it's unproven to me yet that they were the architect or specific master of this attack. There's a lot of misinformation coming out of the region right now, which is why part of my message earlier was to reserve judgment on some of these things until facts are formally unearthed and investigated. I just think that's unproven yet. Don't want to be an apologist for Iraq. There's nothing.
Hypothetically, looking through Iran's sort of strategic lens, why might they keep Hezbollah on the sidelines? How might they be thinking about Hezbollah as another chess piece to play?
The argument I've been most persuaded by is I think if Hezbollah does get in the fray, that will be evidence that this is part of a choreographed set of activities by Iran. But I think they also recognize that they risk the destruction of Hezbollah, which is their most effective foreign proxy for exercising influence in the Levant and beyond, an extremely valuable asset for the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps. In fact, their commander customarily sits on the governing council of the Islamic Jihad organization, their military wing, right? So I think I'll wait to see that Hezbollah gets fully involved in this and not simply skirmishes across the northern border, as everybody's quite accustomed to. That's what we've seen so far. I think they might not put Hezbollah into the fight because of the fear of losing them. They'll be destroyed. Israel has no patience and no sense of humor for Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. They've made mistakes there before. They've learned from them. And although it would distract somewhat from the fight in the south, these are separate Israeli military commands, the northern command and the southern command. They will have the assets to fight and destroy Hezbollah assets in the north, which have been held in reserve and are sort of a trump card on security in that part of the world for years. So my expectation is informed by not much more than intuition at this point. That's all we have, is that Hezbollah is not going to be fully supportive and not going to join in this fight. And I think it's a fear of Iran losing its most effective tool, its most effective proxy tool in the region. And that's what would happen to them if they enter in full fury.
Maybe if I can add just a couple of notes, and I wish Bianca Adair was here because this is her thing, right? So, but she does a great job. The term that we use, proxy militias, she does a great job sort of disaggregating that and demonstrating that they're proxies in the sense that they're often funded and supported, but they're not proxies in that they take instructions directly from Iran. They each, Hezbollah, Hamas, many others in Syria, and some of the Shia militia in Iraq, they don't take orders directly from Iran. And so they are on the same page sometimes, and they're not on the same page sometimes. So that's one of the reasons why I would tend to agree with what Steve has to say right now, that unless there are other indicators, I don't think that it's fully coordinated, and that this will probably be a single incident.
I mean, I have a different opinion from the two gentlemen. I think I was clear, but I'll say further. I was an intelligence officer for a while, and I left and moved into policy because I'm kind of like, well, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, I'm not going to wait for the DNA test. And so,
It's highly likely a duck. With limited certainty.
Right. So that's, number one. Number two, I spent a long time studying Iranian proxies in Iraq and elsewhere, and there are certain similarities. But taking a step back, I would just say Iran has been building this ring of fire around Israel for decades now. And to what end? What is it for? And if you look at the domestic issue, challenges that we're facing here in the U.S., that Israel is certainly facing, is this not a good time if they were going to do something? Is this a good time for them to do that? Potentially, I would argue, yes, it could be. So again, I'm not so sure. If you look at what Hezbollah's done in Lebanon, they've spent decades. First, they were importing them from Iran, these precision-guided munitions, but they have, whole factories in Beirut, underneath civilian apartment complexes, and they're turning out a lot of those things. And while the threat, years ago was bad, but not perhaps existential, some would argue it has reached that level for Israel. And so I take a slightly different view, and I think also the calculation amongst Iranian senior leadership is they know how we operate. They know how careful we are. They know how much we regret the intelligence failures that led us into Iraq, for example. And I think they're counting on, if there's no smoking gun, potentially, they're counting on us saying, well, we don't really know. All we know is Hamas did XYZ, potentially funded by Iran, not clearly guided by Iran. And I think it's clear they played a major role.
And just to close the loop on this, I think certainly they've funded Hamas for years, and whether or not they gave the immediate order, this can be fairly laid at Iran's door. And surely they see the temptation for Israel, potentially for the United States, to return to sender and go back to the source of this, which is them. Keeping Hezbollah poised in the north is leverage. It's a deterrent for Israel and for us to send this back to Iran and to force them to pay a cost for it. So as long as Hezbollah waits and is poised to do something, we are also deterred from responding potentially. I want to talk a bit about the hostage issue, which is a very difficult and painful one here. Also, especially about the American hostages. We do have former U.S. policymakers here, and so how we would assess that. I do want to pause here, and perhaps in recognition of Dean Chesney, we talked about the law of armed conflict. Maybe I'll just give the back of the cereal box explanation of some of those principles that are at play here, and hopefully that will be something that helps you all interpret the news as you're reading it and seeing it. The most important principle that Professor Chesney was talking about in the law of armed conflict is the distinction between civilians and combatants. There is no balancing military necessity against that one. It is flatly forbidden to kill civilians, to kill non-combatants in the service of any military objective. Now, that doesn't mean it's always illegal to conduct an action that results in the death of civilians. Those are tragedies, but not necessarily illegalities, as long as you have a valid military target. Now, how do you decide whether you can hit that military target? You have to assess something called proportionality, and there you weigh the military benefit against the harm to civilians. And this is where it gets complicated and interesting. Of course, that's a very fact-based determination. You look at what the commander knew at the moment. What was the satellite imagery showing? What did the drones that we had on the scene tell us? Who was in the vicinity? But if the other side intentionally moves civilians into the area, that affects the proportionality calculus. And it gives the commander more leeway under international law to take that strike. And this gets to some of what Hamas's tactics are and some of these cynical tactics that you've been alluding to. Because Hamas also has obligations under international law to protect their own civilians. That's a very clear obligation. You have to move your own civilians away from your military installations, and it is absolutely forbidden to move them towards military installations to use them as human shields. And unfortunately, I fear that this is something that's been widely documented in the past. There's a long NATO report about this, Hamas's use of human shields, if you want to Google it. And so I fear that this is going to intensify some of the foreseeable and very tragic harm to innocent civilians that we're likely to see as a collateral result of military strikes on military targets. And just to close out the legal discussion, hostage taking, which is the use of non-combatant prisoners as leverage, is flatly forbidden under international law. And unfortunately, we've seen that at really unprecedented scale. I know that CIA has some tragic experience with Hezbollah specifically in the use of hostages. I fear we're going to see further tragedies, but it does present a real conundrum for policymakers. Israeli policymakers, and now to close the loop, American policymakers. You all have been in positions where you've had the opportunity to react to these. What kind of calculations are American policymakers making right now about how we find those people? Are we prepared to take any potential military action to rescue our citizens, and so forth? Simone, do you want to start here?
Sure. If the media reports are accurate, and that's a big if in this conflict, certainly, we have deployed some folks who do hostage rescue to serve on the ground as advisors. That's what's being reported. That's pretty standard. Every time an American is taken hostage, in this case by a terrorist organization, they're going to get as close as they can and start collecting intelligence, try to learn where our hostages are being held, and then start figuring out how they can get to them. I can only imagine media reporting being what it is. I've seen several reports that their hostages are split between several different groups in several different locations. That makes a lot of sense. They're probably moving them around a lot too. So it just makes a hostage rescue scenario incredibly difficult. Also, given just the geography of Gaza and how everyone's kind of on top of each other there, there's probably a lot of civilians around as well. It's a very complicated. It'd be a very complicated and dangerous operation. So I hope that and trust that those reports are accurate, that we do have folks on the ground that are working to figure out this problem, but it's going to be one of the most, if not the most, difficult, challenging, dangerous hostage rescues probably in our lifetime. And so, I wish them the best. I hope anyone involved in that is able to get as many people out as possible and stay safe themselves. But it's a pretty harrowing situation.
I think I just had two small points. One, as Simone mentioned, it has been reported that some of the U.S. Special operators are in the region to serve as advisors. I think it's based on some of my experiences. I think it's safe to say that their advice will be appreciated, but the Israelis are extremely capable at this. They've been dealing with hostage takers for years and have a number of highly disciplined, capable units that exist for this purpose. And I agree it's going to be extremely difficult mission. The only thing I would encourage you to watch for as an indicator or as something you can expect to be going on is as horrible as the attacks were, as high as the emotions are running, and as much anger is present in this situation, you can rest assured that there are already efforts to mediate and communicate underway. And in that regard, in past conflicts between Hamas and Israel in Gaza, past hostage-taking incidents involving Israelis, including the now infamous Gilad Shalit, for whom Prime Minister Netanyahu exchanged a large number of prisoners. Egypt is essential in all of this because of their history with Gaza, because of the geography. They're the only state with a border other than Israel with Gaza, and because of some of the skill and acquired relationships of their intelligence service, they'll have the ability to communicate between two parties. And if there is a hostage negotiation or trade or signs of good faith or any gestures at all, you can probably rest assured that the Egyptians are in part carrying a lot of water, and that's very helpful to a conflict like this that could easily be inflamed. The Egyptians lend a very calming, historically grounded and disciplined measure of support to this. So that's something I would certainly be watching. I know the Qataris and some others that have relations with both parties are trying to play that role, but the Egyptians have proven in the past quite indispensable.
Final question before we try to take a couple from the audience. This is the latest evidence that global order is fraying. We had the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We've had a series of coups in West Africa, putting military governments in charge of those countries. Azerbaijan launched a little noticed ground invasion of the Nagorno-Karabakh enclave. And so we're seeing countries increasingly take their shot and make aggressive and risky moves that they might not have taken earlier. Is the United States, as de facto the guarantor, for lack of a better word, of global order, or the greatest provider of security in the global arena, are we prepared, are we equipped to deal with this increasingly insecure environment, especially with the risk of, for example, a Chinese invasion of Taiwan? Paul, do you want to take this one?
All right.
Easy.
Sure. So I think we have the capacity, broadly speaking, but I think we're talking about preparation in terms of years, not days, weeks, or months. We've demonstrated before that we do have a capacity to fight two enormous wars in two enormously different parts of the globe, and I still think that we can draw upon that capacity if we decide to domestically. So is the capacity there? Yes, I do think the capacity is there. And depending on the perceived or actual injury to U.S. interests popularly within the United States, we will draw on that capacity or we won't. And I won't try to guess whether that's the case or not at this moment. But I do think we have much more capacity to do more in a way that does not necessarily neglect responsibilities here.
I think you mean latent economic and national capacity.
Right.
There are questions about, do we have enough defense industrial capacity, for example, to supply munitions needs to multiple allies at the same time? Simone, do you want to?
Yes, I would like to respond and say the answer to that is resounding no. We don't have the capacity. For the first time, since the Russians invaded Ukraine, you hear the NSC spokesman saying we're nearing the end of the line with, our aid to Ukraine. And that, would he have said that if this, war with Hamas hadn't kicked off? Our manufacturing capacity with respect to munitions and other types of weapons is not meeting demand. We are years behind in several key munitions, and we are having trouble, just to be frank. So I don't know. I mean, there's certain types of munitions, like 152 millimeter rounds, for example. They don't exist on Earth anymore. I mean, there's like one or two countries that are not friendly to the U.S. that are producing them. So I think that we need to actually take a careful look at that. When you go back to World War II, for example, where we did have this incredible manufacturing capacity. I mean, there were a couple years there where we were turning out like 50,000 aircraft or something insane. It took a couple years to build up to that, and we had to basically stop producing anything else and just make war materials. If we decide that we're going to be all things to all people, we may have to just halt everything and just go back to that. And so, I love our military. Both of my brothers served in the Marine Corps. I'm very proud of them and grateful to them. But, we have a capacity issue, in my opinion, and we have to be very clear-eyed about it and speak about that honestly. That's my opinion. And I agree with you, Professor Slick, on the Egypt issue, by the way. I think Qatar tried to mediate and failed, and Egypt once again proved its incredible value and importance by by trying to mediate in the last conflict, and hopefully they will be able to keep this from getting too bad. But I think the cards are. I think it's unlikely.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to read the Texas National Security Review, which you can find at tnsr.org.